The box that held memories. The morning sun had barely risen when Sandra stood in her driveway, the small wooden box resting in her hands. Birds chirped softly in the distance, but her heart raced louder than anything around her. She hesitated for a long moment before untying the brown paper. It was wrapped with care, the kind of care that meant something. Inside was another note, handwritten, neat, calm. It said, "Don't open this alone. Come to the old coffee shop we used to visit after shoots. 10 a.m. sharp," she smiled faintly. She knew exactly which one he meant. The little place with cracked tiles, mismatched chairs, and a smell of roasted beans that lingered in your clothes. They hadn't been there in years. She got dressed quietly, her curiosity growing every minute. There was something about Keanu's way of doing things. Even a simple message felt like an adventure. By the time she reached the cafe, he was already there, sitting in a corner booth by the window, a cup of black coffee in front of him. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable as always. "You're late," he said softly, though his lips curved into a smile. "You're impossible," she replied, placing the box on the table between them. "Now, are you going to tell me what this is, or should I guess?" He leaned back. "Open it." Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside were a few old photographs, a folded newspaper clipping, and a small cassette tape labeled 1995, Day 17. Sandra gasped. "Wait, is this from Speed?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah. Remember that day the bus broke down between takes? She did." It had been a long, chaotic day. Technical issues, delays, endless retakes. But there had also been laughter, long talks between scenes, and a strange calm that only Keanu could create in the middle of madness. "You kept these all this time?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Not all," he said. "Just the ones that mattered." She picked up one photo. It showed them sitting on the bus set, both covered in dust, laughing at something off camera. She remembered that moment, the way he'd made a joke about her coffee spilling and how the whole crew had relaxed because of it. "You said this was a prank," she said finally. "But this feels more like nostalgia." He sipped his coffee, his eyes thoughtful. "That's part two. Sometimes the prank isn't to make someone laugh, it's to make them remember." Sandra smiled, shaking her head. "You really are something else," he chuckled quietly. "Keep going." She pulled out the folded newspaper clipping. It was an article from years ago, an interview where she had once said, "Keanu Reeves is the calmest person I've ever met. He notices kindness in everyone even when no one notices him." She looked up, a little embarrassed. "You saved this?" "It was the first time someone said something about me that felt real," he said quietly. "Not about movies, not about fame, just about noticing." There was a long pause. The sound of cups clinking filled the air. For a moment, they were no longer Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, just two people remembering where it all began. She held the cassette tape gently. "Do you have a player for this?" He smiled faintly and pointed to a small portable recorder on the table. "Press play." She did. A low hiss filled the air, then the sound of laughter, young voices, their voices. They were joking, teasing each other during the filming of Speed. She could hear herself complaining about her hair, and Keanu laughing softly in the background, saying, "You look perfect, Sandra." Her heart skipped. She hadn't remembered that line until now. The recording continued. Small pieces of forgotten moments, background chatter, jokes, and quiet conversations between takes. She covered her mouth as tears welled up. "You kept this for 30 years?" Keanu's eyes softened. "I didn't plan to. I just never threw it away," she laughed through her tears. "And you call this a prank?" He smiled. "It's an emotional prank, the kind that hits you later." They sat quietly for a while, listening to the rest of the tape. Then he said something that made her pause. "There's another part," he whispered. "One you have to find." "Find?" she asked. He nodded toward the bottom of the box. "Lift the photos." Beneath them was a folded envelope sealed with wax. She opened it carefully. Inside was a small hand-drawn map. It led to a park near the Hollywood Hills. Written in his handwriting was a message. "The final clue is where you once said you'd build a dream home if life ever got quiet." Sandra stared at it, stunned. You remember that? Of course, he said softly. You said it while we were sitting on the grass eating sandwiches from the craft truck. You looked up at the sky and said, if peace was a place, it would be right here. She smiled, shaking her head slowly. You're unbelievable, he grinned. I told you this prank takes time. They left the cafe together, driving in silence through the winding streets. The city shimmered in morning light. When they arrived at the park, the air felt still, like time had slowed down just for them. As they walked to the spot marked on the map, Sandra noticed something strange. A small wooden bench stood under a tree, carved with the words, "For those who listen before they speak." She looked at him, puzzled. You did this, didn't you? He didn't answer. Instead, he sat down and gestured for her to join him. You once told me, he said quietly, that real friendship is when you can sit in silence and still feel understood. I thought maybe this spot should remember that. She felt her throat tighten again. The air grew heavy with emotion. You carved this? She whispered. He nodded. Years ago. I used to come here when things got too loud. She turned to face him fully. Why tell me now? He smiled faintly. Because the prank isn't over yet. You still have to guess what's inside the second box. Second box? She blinked. What second box? The one that's been in your car all this time? Her eyes widened. What? He grinned mischievously. You didn't think I'd only leave one, did you? She laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. Keanu Reeves, you are something else. He stood up slowly. The next part, he said, isn't about the past. It's about something I never told you. She looked at him, her curiosity turning into quiet suspense. Something you never told me? He nodded. And when you open that second box, you'll understand why this prank was never really a prank. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere far away, a child laughed. Sandra took a deep breath, realizing this was more than a game. It was a journey into the unspoken, into memories she didn't even know she'd kept. All right, she said softly. Let's see where this goes. As they walked back toward her car, the camera hidden by Keanu's team captured their quiet smiles, two souls connected by laughter, time and something even deeper that words couldn't define. But as she unlocked her car, her heart skipped again. Under the passenger seat was another small box, unwrapped, simple, and sealed with a note that said, "Open only when you're ready to remember everything." Sandra froze. Keanu looked at her with that same calm, patient smile. That's part 3, he said softly. And trust me, you'll want to sit down for that one. The Quiet Beginning. The story begins on a calm afternoon in Los Angeles. The sun was soft, touching the leaves outside the studio where Sandra Bullock sat waiting. She was early, as always. The crew moved around, setting up lights and testing sound, but her focus drifted toward the empty chair across from her, Keanu Reeves's chair. They were meeting again after months to record a small charity video together. Something simple, something about kindness. She smiled, thinking about how calm he always looked, even when the world around him seemed chaotic. But today, something felt different. There was a small note left on her script. It said only one line. Wait for me before you start reading. She frowned slightly, curious but patient. Keanu was known for his little surprises, not the kind that startled people, but the kind that stayed with you long after the moment passed. She thought maybe it was part of the shoot, maybe something for the camera, but there was a strange silence in the room. The director whispered something to an assistant and left quickly. Sandra sensed something was being planned, but she couldn't quite tell what. 10 minutes passed. No Keanu. The crew avoided her eyes, trying not to give anything away. She looked around, her lips curling into a half-smile. All right, she said softly. What's going on? No one answered. Then suddenly, the lights went off. The whole studio fell silent. Sandra froze. A second later, soft music began to play, slow piano notes, familiar yet distant. Her heartbeat quickened. Keanu? She called out into the dim space, no reply. She stood up, her eyes scanning the room. The piano kept playing, and then a soft voice echoed through the speakers. "Sometimes," the voice said, "the people who make us smile the most are the ones who understand silence better than words." It was Keanu's voice. A soft light appeared behind her. She turned and saw a projection on the wall. Old clips from their early days together, from the set of Speed, from interviews, from behind-the-scenes laughter. She felt her throat tighten. The video showed bloopers, funny moments, times when she teased him or he made her laugh uncontrollably. It wasn't a fancy edit. It was raw, real, and emotional. She covered her mouth, whispering, "Oh my God." The video ended with one line in white letters. "This is not the prank yet. This is the warm-up." The lights flicked back on. Everyone in the studio was smiling. Sandra was still trying to catch her breath. She shook her head, half laughing, half tearing up. "He did not just do that," she said. The director chuckled. "He told us to roll cameras the moment you arrived." She sat back down, trying to hide her blush. "What's he up to this time?" No one answered. Again. Then the door opened. Keanu walked in, holding a coffee tray and pretending to look confused. "Hey," he said casually. "Did something happen? Why is everyone smiling like that?" Sandra laughed, pointing at him. "You, what did you do?" He shrugged with the calmest face imaginable. "Me? Nothing. I just got coffee." But there was something in his eyes, that quiet sparkle, the kind that meant trouble was coming. The harmless, sweet kind of trouble only Keanu could cause. The shoot began, and they both sat across from each other under soft lights. The cameras rolled. They were supposed to read from the script, lines about compassion, giving, and gratitude. But when Sandra opened her script, she froze. The words had been replaced. The first page said, "Dear Sandra, you once said coffee tastes better when shared with someone kind. So here's your task. Read this letter out loud without crying." She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing. "You rewrote my script?" He smiled faintly. "Technically, I improved it." The crew chuckled quietly. Sandra took a breath and began reading. As she read, the letter spoke of friendship, patience, and laughter through years of distance. Keanu wrote about how their shared scenes were not just acting, but small lessons in understanding people. "You always noticed when someone was tired," the letter said. "You always thanked the crew first. That's something not many stars do." Her eyes glistened. She paused halfway, trying to laugh it off. "This is your idea of a prank?" Keanu leaned forward, smiling softly. "Oh, that's just part one." The cameras caught her reaction, the way she smiled through tears, the way her heart visibly softened. She knew him too well to think it would end there. The rest of the day went smoothly, but Sandra couldn't stop wondering what he meant by part one. As the shoot wrapped, the director told her to wait for one last shot. Keanu had already left the room. The crew rolled a new camera, and on the monitor, a short clip started playing. It was Keanu again, this time in a completely different location, holding a small box. "You once told me," he said on camera, "that pranks are only fun when they make someone feel seen. So tomorrow morning, check your car trunk before you drive to set." Sandra gasped. What did he do now? The director smiled. "He said you'd say that." Everyone laughed, but Sandra felt that strange mix of fear and affection only Keanu's surprises could bring. She went home that night with her mind spinning. What could possibly be waiting in her car? A joke? A message? A gift? She tried to sleep, but the curiosity kept her awake. The next morning, as dawn broke over Los Angeles, she walked quietly to her car. The lot was empty. She unlocked the door, opened the trunk, and froze. Inside was a small wooden box wrapped in brown paper. On top was a note written in his neat handwriting, "This is where the real prank begins." She touched the box gently, heart racing, unsure whether to laugh or cry. For some reason, it didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like something deeper, something meant to remind her of a bond that went far beyond movies or fame. She whispered softly, "Keanu, what are you up to?" But deep down, she already knew. This was not just a prank. This was something that would change how she saw him forever. And as she lifted the box in her hands, the camera hidden nearby recorded everything, because of course Keanu had planned even that. The secret that time kept quiet. The drive back to Sandra's house felt heavier than usual. She kept glancing at the small box resting quietly on the seat beside her. It looked so ordinary, yet it carried a strange kind of weight, the kind that pressed softly against your chest without warning. Keanu followed her on his motorcycle just a few feet behind, his face calm as always. When she parked in front of her house, she didn't get out right away. She stared at the box for a full minute before whispering, "What are you hiding, Keanu?" He parked his bike, removed his helmet, and walked up the driveway slowly. "You're scared to open it," he said gently. She smiled faintly. "Scared?" "Me? No, just careful," he chuckled. "Same thing." They went inside, the morning light pouring through her living room windows. The air smelled faintly of coffee and lavender, her usual calm space. But today, it felt different, alive, expectant. Keanu sat on the couch while she placed the box on the table. She noticed his hands, relaxed, steady, but there was a tiny tremor at the edge of his fingers. That was rare. Keanu never showed nerves. "Before you open it," he said softly, "promise you'll listen before you speak." She tilted her head. "Now I'm really nervous." He gave her that quiet, gentle look, the one that could disarm anyone. "It's not bad," he said. "It's just honest." She took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside were 3 small objects: an old movie ticket, a folded piece of paper, and a small silver ring. Her hand froze above the ring. "What is this?" she whispered. "Start with the paper," he said quietly. She unfolded it slowly. It was a letter written years ago. The paper slightly yellowed. The ink faded. She began to read aloud. "Dear Sandra, you'll probably never read this. Maybe it'll end up in a drawer, or maybe I'll lose the courage to give it to you. But there's something I wanted to say after filming ended. Something I didn't know how to say then." She stopped, her throat tightening. Her eyes moved to him. He said nothing, just nodded for her to continue. "Thank you for being kind when everyone was tired. Thank you for laughing even when things were falling apart. You made heavy days light. You made silence easy." The words blurred for a moment. She blinked away a tear and continued. "I've worked with many people, but no one taught me patience the way you did. If someday you find this letter, know that my favorite scene wasn't the one the world watched. It was the one where we just sat. No cameras, no noise, just peace. That's when I realized kindness is stronger than fame." By the time she finished reading, her eyes were full of tears. The room was silent. "Keanu," she whispered. He looked down, his voice quiet. "I wrote that the night before our last day on Speed. I wanted to tell you how much that project meant to me, but I never found the right moment. So I kept it." "You kept it for 30 years?" she said softly. "Yeah. And I thought maybe, after all this time, it deserved to be seen." She shook her head in disbelief, smiling through tears. "You're calling this a prank?" He smiled faintly. "A prank with meaning. They're rare." Her eyes went back to the small silver ring. "And this?" His tone softened. "That's not mine. It's yours," she frowned. "Mine?" "Yeah," he said. "You gave it away." She looked at him, confused. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Remember the crew member, Nora? The one who had to leave the film because her daughter was sick?" She nodded slowly. "Yes." "I gave her my ring. She needed money for treatment, so I told her to pawn it." He nodded. She did. "But she didn't want to keep the money. She called me later crying and asked me to return it to you. But I didn't. I told her I'd hold on to it until the right moment." Sandra covered her mouth. You kept it?" "For years," he said softly. "I thought about giving it back 100 times, but something always stopped me. I figured maybe I was waiting for the right kind of silence." Her eyes filled again, the weight of memory pressing deep into her chest. "Why now?" she whispered. He smiled sadly. "Because lately I've been thinking about the things we never finish. The words, the promises, the small kindnesses. And maybe this was one of them." She turned the ring in her hand, the metal catching the light. "You remembered every detail," she said quietly. "You remember people," he replied. "I remember moments." For a long time, neither spoke. The clock ticked softly. Then she noticed the third object, the old movie ticket. She lifted it carefully. It was for a late-night screening of A Walk in the Clouds, dated the same year they filmed Speed. She laughed softly. "You saw your own movie?" He grinned. "Not exactly. I bought 2 tickets that night. One for me, one for someone who didn't show up." She looked at him, puzzled. He smiled. "You." Her eyes widened. "I invited you," he continued. "Remember? I said, 'Hey, there's a late show, you should come.' And you said, 'Maybe.' But you got busy. And I never told you that I actually waited." Sandra stared at him, her expression softening into something between guilt and awe. "You waited for me?" "Not long," he said, smiling. "Just long enough to realize that some things are better left as maybes. Because maybes keep the story open." The room fell quiet again. She leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "So this prank," she began. "Isn't a prank," he finished. "It's a reminder. The kindness doesn't disappear, it just waits quietly until we remember it." She smiled faintly. "You're impossible, you know that?" He laughed softly. "I get that a lot." They sat there for a long while, watching the sunlight shift across the floor. Something in the air had changed, not dramatic but deep, like 2 pages finally meeting in the same chapter after years apart. Then, just as the silence settled, Sandra noticed something scribbled inside the box lid. She tilted it toward the light. It said, "Part 4. Find the letter under the bench." She looked at him. "You hid something else?" He shrugged innocently. "You didn't think I'd stop now, did you?" She laughed, wiping her eyes. "You are unbelievable. And you," he said, smiling, "are too easy to prank." She shook her head, laughing softly. "Fine. We go back to the park tomorrow?" He nodded. "Yeah. Early. Sunrise." As he stood to leave, she stopped him at the door. "Keanu?" He turned. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for this. For remembering." He smiled. That small, gentle smile that carried 1,000 unspoken things. "I never really forgot." And with that, he left, the quiet echo of his motorcycle fading down the street, leaving Sandra standing there, holding a ring, a letter, and a memory that suddenly felt alive again. She looked down at the box one last time and whispered, "Part 4, under the bench." And for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the thrill of not knowing what comes next. The letter beneath the sunrise. The sky was still gray when Sandra pulled into the quiet park, the same one where Keanu had carved that small message on the wooden bench. The morning air was cool, almost shy, carrying the scent of dew and earth. Her heart beat softly but steadily, as if it already knew something important was waiting for her there. The bench stood under the same tree, its bark glistening faintly from the night's mist. She walked slowly toward it, clutching a small thermos of coffee. Every step felt like walking deeper into a memory. For a moment, she stood still and looked at the carving. "For those who listen before they speak." She ran her fingers over the letters, whispering, "You always listened, didn't you, Keanu?" She sat down, took a deep breath, and looked underneath the bench. Her heart stopped for a second. Taped to the underside was a small envelope sealed with wax, just like the last one. It had her name written on it in Keanu's neat handwriting, Sandra. She pulled it loose carefully, brushing off a bit of dust. Before opening it, she looked around. The park was empty except for a few birds hopping in the grass. She felt a strange sense of peace, the kind that often comes right before tears. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a folded letter and a single dried flower pressed between the pages. Her eyes softened when she saw it. It was a daisy. Fragile but still bright in its own way. The letter began in Keanu's handwriting. "Dear Sandra, if you're reading this, it means you've followed all the clues, which also means you're patient, as always. You see, this isn't really about a prank anymore. It never was. This was about something I never managed to tell you out loud." She paused, her breath catching. The morning sun began to rise, touching the park with faint golden light. "Back then, when we were filming, I used to watch how you treated people. Not just the stars, but the crew, the drivers, the assistants. You didn't know it, but I learned something from that. You showed me that fame isn't a wall that separates people. It's a window to reach them. I never said thank you for that. Sandra blinked fast, her eyes misting. After the movie ended, I wrote you a letter. Not the one you read yesterday, another one. I wanted to tell you that I liked you more than I probably should have, but I also respected you too much to say it. I thought about it many times, but sometimes silence feels safer than confession. I guess this letter is me breaking that silence finally. She stopped reading. The words felt heavy but kind, carrying years of unspoken emotion between their lines. The sun rose higher, brushing warmth across her face. She continued, I'm not telling you this to change anything. I'm telling you because truth deserves to be spoken even if it's late. And maybe in another lifetime we would have walked the same road longer. But even in this one, I'm grateful for the miles we did share. A small smile trembled on her lips. She whispered softly, Oh, Keanu, you once told me that kindness lasts longer than love. I didn't believe you then, but after all these years I realize you were right. Love fades, fame fades, but kindness stays. In the quiet gestures, in old letters, in moments like this. So maybe this prank wasn't about laughter at all. Maybe it was my way of saying thank you. For being someone I never had to pretend around. She pressed the letter to her chest, closing her eyes. She could almost hear his voice, quiet and sincere, like it always was. After a while, she noticed a small note tucked behind the main page. It was shorter, written in a rush. P.S. If you're crying right now, don't. I promised myself this would make you smile. Look behind the bench! Her tears broke into a small laugh. She turned and looked behind the bench. Hanging from one of the lower branches of the tree was a small paper wind chime, spinning gently in the morning breeze. Attached to it was a tag that said, A sound for every memory. She touched it softly. It made a faint musical sound, quiet but beautiful. As she looked closer, she realized the chime wasn't just decoration. Each small piece of paper tied to it had short quotes from their old interviews and moments together. One said, You make me laugh when I'm trying to be serious. Another, Coffee is better with company. And one more, Real friendship doesn't fade with time. It grows quietly. Her laughter turned into gentle tears again. She sat there for a long time, letting the wind move through the chime, the sound mixing with birdsong. It felt as if the air itself was whispering memories back to her. Then she heard footsteps behind her. I thought you might be here early, Keanu said softly. She turned, smiling through her tears. You knew I couldn't wait, he smiled back. You always were the curious one. You could have just told me, you know, she said, folding the letter carefully. All of this. It's beautiful, but it's a lot to feel before breakfast. He chuckled quietly. You would have laughed it off if I said it out loud. Maybe, she admitted. But maybe not. He sat beside her on the bench, their shoulders almost touching. For a while, neither spoke. They just watched the light spread over the hills, soft and gold. This park, he said after a while. It always felt peaceful to me, like the world stopped pretending here. She nodded. Maybe that's why you brought me here. He looked at her, smiling faintly. No. I brought you here because some memories deserve to live outside of screens and scripts. She laughed softly. So what's next, Mr. Prankster? He smiled with that same spark of mystery. There's one last part. One last part? He nodded. It's not here. It's somewhere we both forgot. She frowned slightly. Forgot? He stood up, brushing off his jeans. You'll know when we get there. She looked at him, curious and emotional all at once. Keanu, you're impossible. He smiled, eyes soft but bright. And you're predictable, and you'll come anyway. She laughed. You're not wrong. He started walking away, turning slightly to look back. Be ready tomorrow. It's time you saw what kindness built behind the scenes. What does that mean? She called out. He didn't answer, just gave a half smile and walked off under the golden light, leaving her sitting on the bench with the letter still in her hands and a heart full of questions. As the wind chime whispered behind her, she looked up at the sky and whispered, What are you really trying to tell me, Keanu? But deep down, she already sensed that the next part wouldn't just be another prank. It would be a revelation. Something deep. Something about both of them. The truth behind the kindness. The next morning, Sandra woke earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through her curtains, soft and golden, painting her walls in calm colors. But her heart wasn't calm. It was restless, not from fear, but from the feeling that something big was waiting for her. She brewed a cup of coffee, stood by her kitchen window, and stared at the small box Keanu had given her days ago. Every clue, every letter, every memory had led to this final step. She whispered to herself, "What are you hiding, Keanu?" Her phone buzzed. One new message. It was from an unknown number, but she knew who it was. "Drive to the studio lot. The old soundstage number 3. You'll understand everything there." She smiled softly. "Of course it's the studio," she murmured. That was where it had all started. The movie, the friendship, the laughter. And maybe this was where it was meant to circle back. By the time she reached the lot, the place was quiet. Film sets were sleeping, trailers parked, cables coiled neatly. Stage 3 stood at the far end, the same old building where they had filmed some of their earliest scenes together. The faded number on the door still had marks from tape, remnants of old projects, old times. She walked inside slowly. It smelled of dust, paint, and something else, nostalgia. The lights were dim, and at first she thought no one was there. But then she noticed a faint glow at the center of the room. A projector. It flickered to life as she stepped closer. The beam hit a white sheet hung against the wall. Old film footage started to play. Scenes from Speed, behind-the-scenes clips, interviews. Her younger self appeared on screen, laughing, joking, chasing lines while Keanu stood beside her, calm and kind. Then his voice echoed softly through the speakers. "If you're watching this, it means I finally decided to finish what I started." Sandra froze. His voice wasn't live. It was a recording. "I told you this was a prank," he continued, "but the truth is it's something I've been planning for years. Not as a joke, but as a memory project. Something to remind us that kindness, the real kind, leaves a trail." The footage changed. It showed random clips, crew members laughing, a lighting technician receiving flowers, a makeup artist hugging someone, an old driver smiling next to a gift box. Then Keanu's voice said, "Do you remember the driver, Rick? He was struggling with his daughter's surgery. You quietly paid for it. You never told anyone. But I found out. And ever since, I wanted to do something that reminded you, and everyone, how one quiet act of kindness can change lives." Sandra's eyes widened. "He knew?" she whispered. The next part of the video played, clips of strangers. A young woman in a hospital, a man fixing bikes for kids, a teacher smiling at her students. "These people," Keanu's voice said, "are all connected to that one act." Rick's daughter recovered and became a nurse. She helped a patient who later became a teacher. That teacher inspired a student who grew up to build a small charity for underprivileged kids. And that charity? Well, you unknowingly funded it too. Full circle. Sandra pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. No, he didn't. But he had. The screen showed old photos of a community center. Children learning, people smiling, murals painted with hope. "I helped them a little too," his voice went on. "But I never told anyone. Because you taught me that real giving doesn't need names. It just needs heart." Her knees grew weak. She sat down slowly, unable to take her eyes off the screen. The video shifted again. This time, Keanu himself appeared. Not the actor on stage, but him, sitting casually in a chair, wearing that familiar black t-shirt, hair slightly messy, eyes calm but deep. "I know you're probably crying right now," he said with a small smile. "Don't. This isn't a sad story. It's just a thank you. I wanted to thank you for reminding me, and the world, that kindness is powerful, that it doesn't fade even when we do." He paused for a moment, his eyes dropping to his hands. "I've spent my life surrounded by cameras," he continued softly, "but some of the best things I've ever seen never made it on film. They were moments like you comforting a scared extra or making someone laugh when they were nervous. I saw all of that, Sandra, and I remembered." Tears rolled down her face. she whispered to the screen. "Why didn't you ever say this to me?" As if answering her, he said, "Because you don't say thank you to sunlight. You just feel grateful that it exists." She covered her face, sobbing quietly. The camera in the recording zoomed out a little. Behind Keanu was something she hadn't noticed before, a mural painted on a wall. It showed 2 coffee cups side by side, and above them the words, "Shared warmth never fades." Then his tone softened again. "You once said that coffee tastes better when shared with someone kind. So I built this." The scene changed, a video montage of the same mural being painted in real life. It wasn't just art, it was part of a cafe. "A real one. It's called the Kindness Cafe," his voice said. "Every order funds meals for children in need. And it's dedicated to you, though your name's not on it. It's just a quiet place where people can rest, talk, and help without being asked." She stood there, stunned. "A cafe?" she whispered. On the screen, Keanu smiled faintly. "I wanted to prank you with memories, but maybe it turned into a gift. Sometimes, life's best jokes end with tears, not laughter." He looked straight into the camera now. "Thank you for being my friend, Sandra. Not just on screen, in life. This prank, this whole thing, was just my way of reminding you that kindness doesn't go unnoticed." The video faded to black. For a moment, the room was silent. Sandra stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes overflowing with tears she didn't even try to wipe away. Then she saw something else. Near the projector was a small table. On it sat a warm cup of coffee, freshly poured, and a note beside it. She picked it up. It said, "Turn around." She did. And there he was. Keanu stood in the doorway, smiling softly. "You made it," he said. Her voice trembled. "You did all this?" He shrugged gently. "I had help. People remember the kind ones, you know." She laughed through her tears. "You're unbelievable." He stepped closer, his voice quiet but steady. "No, I just learned from the best." For a long moment, they said nothing. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector still spinning behind them. Sandra looked at him with tears in her eyes and said softly, "This was never a prank, was it?" He smiled. "Maybe not. Maybe it was a lesson, wrapped in laughter." She nodded slowly, her heart full, her voice trembling. "You've always known how to make silence speak." He smiled, his eyes gentle. "And you've always known how to listen." The two of them stood there in the golden morning light, not as actors, not as celebrities, but as 2 people who had quietly changed each other's lives. And for a brief, quiet moment, the prank that had started with laughter ended in something deeper. Gratitude, kindness, and understanding. The final gift, the next morning, Los Angeles woke to the golden hush of sunrise. The city was slowly stirring to life. Cars humming in the distance, birds calling softly, and a breeze that carried the smell of something warm and sweet. But for Sandra Bullock, it wasn't just another morning. Today, she was driving toward something that felt like an ending, or maybe a beginning disguised as one. Keanu had given her an address written on a napkin. No name, no explanation. Just a simple note that said, "Come when the world is quiet enough to hear your heart." The drive took her through narrow streets lined with small bakeries, street vendors, and sleepy cafes. Then she saw it, a small, brick-walled corner cafe with wide windows, sunlight spilling through them like gold. The sign above the door read, "The Kindness Cafe." Beneath it, in tiny letters, it said, "A place for quiet hearts." Her breath caught. She parked her car and just sat there for a moment watching the people going in and out. It wasn't a fancy place. There were no paparazzi, no lights, no glamour. But the faces she saw, the laughter, the calm, the sense of belonging, felt more powerful than anything she'd seen on any screen. She stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. The smell of roasted coffee beans and fresh bread filled the air. The walls were decorated with handwritten notes, drawings, and photos, all from visitors who had come and left something behind. Behind the counter, a young woman smiled warmly. "Good morning. You must be Sandra." Sandra blinked.
"How did you—"
The woman smiled gently.
"He told us you'd come."
"He?" Before the woman could answer, a familiar voice spoke from the corner. She means me. Sandra turned, and there he was. Keanu sitting at a small wooden table near the window, 2 mugs of coffee in front of him. His smile was soft, warm, and filled with the same quiet kindness that had guided every step of this strange, beautiful journey. "You built this?" she asked softly, walking toward him. He nodded. "Yeah, but it's not really mine. It belongs to everyone who needed a little peace." She looked around. The laughter of 2 kids coloring on the floor, an elderly couple sharing a pastry, a man reading a book by himself with the softest smile. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's home," he said simply. She sat across from him, her eyes wandering over the walls. One particular frame caught her attention. Inside, it was a small, faded photo, the one of them laughing on the speed set, covered in dust and joy. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "This cafe was inspired by a friendship that reminded us all, kindness never expires." Tears welled in her eyes again. "Keanu," he smiled softly. "It's true. It started with your small act of helping someone decades ago. I just followed its path. Turns out kindness travels faster than fame." She laughed quietly, brushing away tears. "You did all of this just to remind me of that?" "Not just you," he said. "Everyone. The crew, the fans, the strangers. This place was built from stories of small kindnesses. Every cup of coffee funds a meal. Every note on the wall honors someone who helped someone else. You started it without knowing." She looked down at her coffee, her reflection trembling in the surface. "You know," she said softly, "when I think of all this, I realize maybe your prank wasn't a prank at all. It was a mirror." "A mirror?" he asked, smiling faintly. "Yeah," she said. "You made me see what I'd forgotten, that even the smallest good thing lives longer than we think." He nodded slowly. "And sometimes people just need to be reminded they've already changed the world, quietly." For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, sipping coffee as sunlight touched their faces. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was full of memories, of gratitude, of all the things they'd never needed to say aloud. Then, the cafe owner, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached their table with something small in her hands. It was a tiny glass jar sealed with a cork, filled with folded paper hearts. She placed it in front of Sandra. "This is for you," she said. "For me?" "Yes. Every person who came here wrote one word that meant kindness to them. We told them it was for the woman who inspired the cafe, even if they didn't know your name." Sandra opened the jar slowly. She unfolded one of the tiny hearts. It said hope. Another said patience. Another healing. Her voice trembled. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Keanu smiled gently. "There's one more in there." She reached to the bottom of the jar and pulled out the smallest, faintest heart. Written on it in familiar handwriting was one word. "You." She looked up, eyes shimmering. "Keanu," he smiled softly, "because that's what you've been all along. The quiet kind of kindness that doesn't fade." Her tears fell freely now. She leaned forward, resting her hand over his. "You don't know how much this means to me?" He looked at her hand, then into her eyes, and said, "I do." "That's why I had to do it." Silence fell again, warm, gentle, and perfect. The cafe door opened, and a small boy ran in holding a flower. He placed it on their table shyly and whispered, "This is for the nice people who made this place." Sandra smiled through tears, taking the flower. "Thank you, sweetheart." Keanu looked at her and said quietly, "See? It keeps growing." She nodded. "It always does." They sat there for a long time, watching the cafe fill with light and laughter. Every sound felt like a heartbeat, steady, alive, full of meaning. Finally, as they stood to leave, she turned back for one last look. On the wall near the door was a new framed note written in Keanu's handwriting. It said, "This cafe is not a monument. It's a reminder that kindness, when shared, never truly ends." She smiled and whispered, "You really got me this time." He grinned. Finally, a prank that worked. They walked out together into the sunlight side by side. No cameras, no fans. just two people carrying years of friendship, laughter, and quiet love that never needed a label. As they reached her car, she looked up at the sky and said softly, "You know, Keanu, maybe this isn't the end of the prank." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" She smiled, eyes twinkling. "Maybe it's my turn next." He laughed. That deep, warm laugh she knew so well. "I'll be waiting." They got into their cars, waved one last time, and drove off in different directions. But somehow it didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like the world had just learned something from them both. Because somewhere in a small corner cafe, kindness was still brewing, one quiet heart at a time.